In late October of 2016, I took a trip to a small cabin deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. I had just turned 34 a few weeks before and had been feeling burned out from work. I was working long hours at a logistics firm in Boise, barely sleeping, eating like garbage, and glued to my phone day and night. I'd been getting chest tightness and grinding my teeth. I knew I needed to unplug and reset for a while. That cabin was supposed to be the answer to that. I found it through a lesser-known rental site a coworker had mentioned. It was nothing fancy, just a single-room log cabin with a stove, a cot, a bathroom with cold water, and a basic kitchen. The pictures made it look rustic and quiet, tucked between trees with a dirt path leading down to a small lake. There was no Wi-Fi, no reception, and no neighbors for a mile or two. It sounded like what I needed. The drive out took over 4 hours. The last stretch of road was all gravel and potholes, winding through dense forest with barely enough space for one car. I got there around 3 in the afternoon. The sun was low, the sky gray and heavy, and the wind had a sharp bite. The cabin sat in a shallow clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. It was smaller than I expected, just a dark wooden structure with a tin roof and a narrow porch. There were 2 chairs on the porch, both a little rusted. Everything smelled like wet wood and moss. Inside, it was clean but bare. There was a cot with a thin mattress, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, a small propane stove, and a chest with some emergency supplies. A couple of windows looked out into the trees. The bathroom was in the back, just a narrow room with a toilet and a sink. No hot water, no mirror. There was a single light hanging from the ceiling, powered by a small generator out back. That was the only source of power. I unpacked my gear, just some clothes, food, water, and a few books. I had a battery-powered lantern, a wind-up radio, and a knife just in case. I had no intention of using my phone. I turned it off and tossed it in my bag. The first night was peaceful. I made a small dinner on the stove, read by the lantern for a while, and went to bed early. It was completely silent out there. No cars, no voices, just the wind and the creaking of trees. It took me a while to fall asleep, but once I did, I slept deeply. I woke up the next morning feeling clearer than I had in months. That second day, I spent walking down to the lake. It was about 15 minutes downhill, through wet leaves and overgrown brush. The lake was small and still, bordered by rocks and reeds. I sat on the bank for a while, watching the clouds shift and the wind move over the water. It was cold but not unbearable. I stayed down there for maybe an hour, then made my way back to the cabin. Later that afternoon, I thought I heard something in the woods. A snapping of branches, maybe a rustle, but nothing loud. Could have been a deer or a bird. I didn't think much of it. Still, I made a note in my notebook to be aware of animals. The place wasn't exactly close to any help. That night, I lit the lantern again and sat on the porch for a while. The wind had died down and the sky had cleared. I could see stars above the tree line, more than I'd seen in years. I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. No noise, no screens, just air and sky and silence. But then I heard something again. It was soft at first, something moving slowly through the brush, maybe 50 or 60 feet off. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the crunch of dead leaves was clear. Stopped, then moved again, slower this time. I froze, listening. The hairs on my arms rose. After about a minute, it stopped completely. I stood up and waited, but nothing followed. After a while, I went back inside and locked the door. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind picked up again, and every creak of the walls sounded louder than it should have. At one point, I thought I heard a low thump outside, like someone dropping something heavy on the porch. I held my breath and waited, staring at the ceiling in the dark. But nothing else happened. No footsteps, no voices, just the wind again. The next morning, I checked the porch. Nothing was out of place, though one of the rusted chairs was a bit farther from the table than I remembered. Could have been the wind. I told myself that and moved on. I went for another walk, farther this time, following an old logging trail that led into the hills. I didn't see anyone. No signs of cabins or campsites, just trees, stumps, and empty forest. It started snowing lightly around noon, so I turned back and made it to the cabin by early afternoon. I was chopping kindling when I noticed something strange. Small scuff marks in the dirt behind the cabin. Not animal tracks. These were longer, like something had been dragged. They started near the side of the cabin and led toward the trees. I followed them for about 20 feet, but they faded quickly into the undergrowth. No blood, no fur, no trash, just marks. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of them, then went back and checked the generator. It was still full and running fine. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept getting up to look out the window. I thought I saw movement once, but it could have been branches swaying. Around 2 a.m., I heard the thump again, louder this time, then what sounded like the creak of a step. I got out of bed and turned off the lantern. I crouched near the window and waited. Nothing. No more sounds. No lights. I sat there for a long time listening. In the morning, I checked again. One of the porch chairs had been moved again, this time turned slightly, facing the door. I checked around the cabin but didn't find any prints. The ground was dry in some spots and wet in others, hard to read. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I had bumped the chair myself. Maybe the wind. But then I noticed something new. Just under the window on the left side of the cabin, there was a small scrape, a fresh one, like something had brushed against the wood. It was faint, just a couple of inches long, but definitely new. I hadn't seen it before. I touched it. It was dry. No paint, no fibers. I checked the other windows. Nothing. That scrape stuck in my mind all day. By the fifth night, I was constantly on edge. I stayed inside, kept the lantern low, and kept the knife close. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like someone breathing just outside the door. Slow, steady. Then a faint tapping sound, like fingers against wood. I didn't move. I just listened. The tapping stopped after maybe a minute, and then there was silence again. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found something that confirmed everything. On the far side of the cabin, near the rear wall, I found a torn piece of fabric stuck in the bark of a nearby tree. It was black, maybe from a jacket or pants. I took it inside and laid it on the table. It looked like nylon. There was no blood on it, but one edge was frayed like it had been ripped. That's when I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been out there, watching, getting close. I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up that afternoon. I didn't care if I had another day left. I didn't want to stay another night. I made sure the generator was off, left the keys on the table like the instructions said, and loaded everything into the car. But before I left, I walked once more around the cabin. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, just impressions in the dirt near the back wall. Adult-sized, wide apart, like someone had been pacing. They were heading away from the cabin toward the woods, but they hadn't been there before. The light snowfall had melted, leaving the ground soft enough to leave prints. I followed them with my eyes. They went about 20 feet, then disappeared into the brush. I didn't follow them. I got in the car and left. I didn't stop until I hit paved road again. Once I had service, I turned my phone back on and checked the area for any local news, any missing people or break-ins, but I didn't find anything. I never called the police. I didn't know what I would say. Nothing had been taken. No one had spoken. There was no crime, just signs, hints. I knew what I felt, and that was enough. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't leave a review. I didn't want anyone to know I'd been there. Sometimes I think about the fabric, the chair, the scrape on the wall. I still have the piece of fabric. I keep it in a drawer in my garage. It reminds me that even in silence, even in peace, you're not always alone. I haven't gone camping since. I still hike sometimes, but only during the day. I stay close to marked trails around other people. It's not fear exactly, it's awareness. A quiet understanding that if you go too far from the world, sometimes something else might find you. Not a ghost, not a monster, just someone, another person, watching. And that's what really stayed with me. It wasn't what I saw, it was what I didn't. Whoever it was didn't want to hurt me. Or maybe they did, but something stopped them. Or maybe they were waiting for one more night. But I didn't give them that. I left. I made it home. And I don't think they followed me. but I'll never be sure. I was 36 when I decided to take a full week off work and spend it alone at a cabin in the northern part of Idaho, not far from the border with Montana. It was late October 2019. I had rented the place online through a small listing site that focused on remote properties, usually owned by individuals rather than companies. The pictures looked simple enough: wooden walls, stone fireplace, 2 beds, a tiny kitchen, an outhouse out back. There was no internet, no cell signal, and the closest town, Ash River, was almost 30 miles away down a winding 2-lane road with barely any signage. That was the appeal for me. I had been burned out at my job in Spokane, tired of the noise and the demands and the routine, and I just wanted to disappear for a few days. No emails, no phone, just me and the woods. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon after a long 5-hour drive. The gravel road that led to the cabin was more like a forgotten trail. It wound up a hill, past a few clearings, then ducked under thick tree cover. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour before I turned onto the road, and once I parked beside the cabin, the silence hit me hard. It was a different kind of quiet out there, not the kind you get in the suburbs at night, but real, total stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person alive. The cabin was about 50 yards from a small lake. You couldn't see the lake from the front porch because of how the trees wrapped around the slope, but I had seen the photos and knew it was there. The structure was old but solid. Thick logs, a metal roof, and a front porch with a sagging bench. No electricity, but there was a propane tank for cooking and a small wood-burning stove for heat. I brought plenty of supplies: canned food, dry goods, water, a small radio with a crank, and a pile of paperback books I'd been meaning to read for years. I even packed a small generator and a battery lantern, though I told myself I'd try to go without them if I could help it. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it unpacking, getting used to the space, and checking the cabin's corners and cabinets. It was musty but clean. A couple of dead spiders in the sink, some old soot in the stove, and a few mouse droppings in the corner under the bed, but otherwise nothing out of place. I walked down to the lake just before sunset. The surface was like glass. There were a few ducks floating in the distance, and some ripples near the far end where I guessed fish were feeding on bugs. I didn't hear a single engine, didn't see a single plane in the sky. Just the water, the breeze, and my own breathing. That night, I fell asleep quickly. The fire in the stove kept the place warm, and I'd brought my own sleeping bag, thick and insulated. The bed creaked a little, and I noticed the wind made the trees groan, but nothing felt off. I slept through the night. The second day, I hiked a little. There were some faint trails behind the cabin that wound uphill into thicker woods. I didn't plan to go far. I didn't bring a GPS or a satellite phone, and I was careful not to push too deep into unknown terrain. I spent a couple hours just exploring nearby, taking note of landmarks and tree patterns so I wouldn't get lost. Felt good, walking with no direction, just letting the forest lead me. When I got back to the cabin, I made a simple meal, read for a while, then sat outside as the sun dipped low. The cold crept in fast after sunset, so I lit the stove again and settled in early. That night, I woke up to a noise. It was soft, like crunching leaves. It might have been an animal walking by outside, maybe a raccoon or deer. I stayed still for a while, just listening. The fire was low, and I didn't want to get up to check. Eventually, I drifted off again. On the third day, things started to feel different. I noticed it in small ways. When I went to the outhouse in the morning, I saw fresh footprints in the soft dirt that didn't match mine. I wear size 12 boots. These were smaller, maybe size 9 or 10, and the tread pattern was different. I squatted down to get a better look. They were only partially pressed in, like whoever made them wasn't heavy. At first, I thought maybe they were old, but the soil was still soft from rain the day before. These were new. I looked around the trees nearby but didn't see anyone. No sound, no movement. I tried not to let it get to me. Maybe a hunter had wandered through. Maybe it was someone checking on the property. But I hadn't heard a car, and I hadn't seen another soul since I'd arrived. I went about my day the same way, short hike, reading, small meals, but I started noticing other small things. One of the firewood stacks behind the cabin looked a little different than I remembered. Some of the logs on top had been shifted slightly off balance. There were scratch marks on the side of the porch railing, like something sharp had been dragged along it. I looked around again, scanning the woods. Still nothing. No movement. No sound but the wind and birds. I told myself it was all in my head, just the isolation getting to me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the cabin felt louder. Every gust of wind made me sit up and listen. I heard something again, crunching, slower this time, deliberate. Then nothing. I got out of bed, quietly, and moved toward the window. I turned off the lantern and let my eyes adjust. It was pitch black out. I could barely see the outline of the trees. I didn't see anyone. No flashlight beams, no movement. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, straining my eyes. Then I got back in bed, not really believing myself anymore. On the fourth day, I found something that made my stomach drop. I had set up a small metal bowl outside to collect rainwater, and that morning it was gone. Just gone. I checked the area around it and found the bowl about 15 feet away, upside down with something inside it. A single torn-off strip of what looked like dark fabric. Not mine. It was thin and frayed, like it had been ripped from a jacket or pants. I turned it over and over, trying to figure out where it could have come from. I didn't recognize the texture or material. I brought it inside and stuffed it in a Ziploc bag, then locked the door, even though I knew it wouldn't do much good out there. I seriously considered leaving that day, but something kept me there. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness. I told myself I had 3 days left, and I wouldn't let fear cut my trip short. I spent most of the day near the cabin, never out of sight of the front door. I didn't even go to the lake. I kept an axe by the fireplace and a knife on me at all times. That night, everything changed. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up again. This time, I knew something was off immediately. There was no noise, but I could feel it. Something wasn't right. I sat up slowly. The stove was cold. I hadn't kept the fire going that night. My breath was visible in the air. I stood and walked to the window, again letting my eyes adjust. I didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed the back door, the one that led to the outhouse, was open. Just slightly, maybe 6 inches. I knew I had closed it. I knew I had locked it. My heart started racing. I reached for the axe. My hands were sweating, even in the cold. I stood still for a long time, listening. I didn't move. No footsteps. No voices. Just the wind outside and the thump of my pulse in my ears. I finally moved toward the door and pushed it shut slowly, then slid the bolt back into place. I stood there for another hour, just watching and listening. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I heard a creak, I tensed up. I watched the windows until the sky started to lighten. The 5th day, I snapped. I packed up most of my things before noon. I didn't care about wasting the last couple days. I just wanted to get out. I loaded my gear into the car and started it up, relieved when the engine turned over without issue. I was about to pull out of the clearing when I stopped. Something told me to look around one last time. I got out and walked to the edge of the woods behind the cabin. That's when I saw it. A makeshift camp, barely noticeable from the cabin, but clear once you were standing above it. Someone had been living out there. A tarp, some scattered trash, a rusted pot, and a bundle of old clothes stuffed into a corner of a hollow log. The ground was trampled, and there were bones, small ones probably from animals, piled in a corner. There was also a broken mirror, a dull knife, and a half-burned notebook I couldn't read. I backed away slowly, got in my car, and drove until I hit pavement, then didn't stop until I was an hour outside of Ash River. I stayed in a motel that night, barely able to sleep. My hands shook as I tried to eat. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. What would I even say? When I got back home, I reported the cabin listing and sent photos of the tarp and the bones to the property owner, but I never heard back. The listing disappeared a week later. I checked the map again, but I couldn't even find the road I'd turned off on, like it had been erased. I still think about it sometimes, how long that person had been out there, watching me, living just out of sight. They never tried to hurt me. They never even confronted me. But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of something just beyond the trees, waiting. And I'll never go back to a place like that again. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend some time alone at a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 29 then, working as a junior graphic designer in Boston, and felt the weight of the busy city crushing me. The constant noise, the rush, and the never-ending flood of emails and phone calls left me drained. I needed a place to clear my head, to breathe fresh air, and to find some peace. The cabin I rented was owned by a friend of a friend, a modest wooden structure tucked away beside a narrow, dirt road, surrounded by thick pine trees. It was a simple place, no electricity, no running water, just a small fireplace, a single bed, a wooden table, and a tiny kitchen area. Exactly what I wanted. I arrived late in the afternoon, carrying my backpack and some groceries. The sun was low but still warm on my skin as I stepped off the beaten path onto the porch. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and pine needles, a comforting scent that immediately made me feel at ease. I took a moment to breathe deeply and listen. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind and distant birdsong. No cars, no voices, just the quiet of the forest. I spent the first day unpacking and exploring the area nearby. There was a small creek about 100 yards behind the cabin, where the water ran clear and cold over smooth rocks. I dipped my hands in and washed my face, feeling the chill wake me up. The sun set early that evening, the sky turning a soft orange before fading to deep blue. I built a fire in the cabin's stone fireplace, using dry wood stacked neatly near the door. The crackling flames filled the room with warmth and a flickering light that danced across the rough wooden walls. The first night was peaceful. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I remember feeling safe, even happy, wrapped in the quiet and the stillness. The next morning, I woke early to a bright sun filtering through the small window. I boiled water on the stove for coffee and made some toast with peanut butter from a jar I had brought. After eating, I decided to take a longer hike. The area was vast and wild, and I wanted to get deeper into the woods. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, a map, and a compass, things I'd learned to carry on trips like this. The map showed some old logging trails that crisscrossed the forest. I picked one and followed it, enjoying the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and the smell of damp earth. As I walked, the trees grew taller and closer together. The light dimmed under the thick canopy. I saw birds flitting between branches, squirrels darting across the path, and the occasional deer bounding away into the underbrush. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. I told myself it was just the way the forest was, but sometimes I felt like the silence pressed down on me, heavy and thick. Around midday, I reached a small clearing where the sun broke through the trees, lighting up a patch of wildflowers and tall grass. I sat on a fallen log to rest, sipping water and enjoying the warmth. The quiet felt good, but I also felt a little uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though every time I looked around, there was nothing but trees and sky. I shrugged it off and continued walking, but I made a mental note to head back soon. The trail began to wind down toward a small lake that wasn't marked on the map. I wasn't sure if I should go, but curiosity got the better of me. The lake was beautiful, dark, still water surrounded by dense forest. A few broken branches stuck out of the water near the shore, and a thin mist hovered just above the surface. I didn't stay long, only a few minutes, then turned back. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was low again, and a cool breeze had started to blow. I made a quick dinner, canned soup and crackers, and sat by the fire as the light faded. That's when I first heard it, a faint rustling outside, near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some small animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. It wasn't the light tapping of a squirrel or the scampering of a rabbit. It was slow, careful steps, like someone walking quietly but steadily through the leaves. I sat very still, listening. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows around the room. The rustling stopped. I waited, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. After a minute or two, I stood up and went to the window to look out. There was nothing there, only the dark shapes of trees and the faint outline of the path leading away from the cabin. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind pushing branches against each other or a deer, but the feeling didn't go away. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, then tried to calm myself with some deep breaths. I told myself I was safe. The cabin was far from the road, and nobody knew I was here. There was no reason for anyone to come. That night, I slept lightly. Every creak of the cabin, every crack of a twig outside made me tense. I kept my flashlight close by and my backpack ready in case I had to leave. I didn't hear the footsteps again that night, but the sense that someone or something had been close lingered in the back of my mind. The next day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I spent some time chopping firewood, fixing a small leak in the roof, and organizing my things. The sun was bright and the air warm, but I felt on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder whenever I went outside, feeling watched. In the late afternoon, I went down to the creek to fill my water bottle and wash some of the sweat off my face and arms. The water was cold and refreshing. As I bent over the edge, I noticed something strange in the mud near the bank. Footprints. They looked fresh, clear, and too large to be a deer or any wild animal. Human footprints. I stared at them for a long time, tracing their path. They led from the forest into the creek and then stopped near the water's edge. No footprints led back the way they came, only the ones going in. That meant whoever had made them hadn't come back the same way. My heart jumped. Why were there fresh human footprints so close to my cabin, and why had they disappeared here? I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. Maybe a local hunter or someone out hiking had passed nearby. But I didn't see any other signs. No broken branches or trash. Nothing to suggest someone had been camping or lingering in the area. I returned to the cabin quickly and locked the door behind me. I double-checked everything again and decided to go to bed early. The sun set, and the wind picked up, blowing through the trees and making the old cabin creak and groan. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, heavy steps circling the cabin. They moved close, then paused, then moved again. The sound was unmistakable, like someone walking on dry leaves and twigs, slow but deliberate. I held my breath, afraid to move, afraid to make any noise. The footsteps stopped near the back door, where the lock was still secure, then moved away again, disappearing into the dark forest. I stayed awake, heart pounding, listening for anything else. The night was long and cold. The next morning, I felt exhausted but determined to leave. I packed my things quickly, took down the firewood stack, and loaded my backpack. As I prepared to walk out, I noticed something on the porch. An old rusty hunting knife, partially buried in the dirt by the steps. It hadn't been there before. My hands shook as I picked it up, realizing someone had been here, close enough to leave a warning or a message. I took the knife inside and locked the door. Then I checked my map and planned the quickest route back to the road. I didn't want to spend another night here. I started walking through the woods, following the narrow dirt path that led back to the main road. The forest seemed different now, darker, less friendly. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept the knife in my hand, ready to defend myself if needed. About 2 hours into the walk, I noticed broken branches and disturbed underbrush along the side of the path. Someone had passed here recently. Then I saw footprints again, similar to the ones by the creek. They ran parallel to the path, sometimes crossing it, as if whoever was following me was trying to stay just out of sight. Panic rose in my chest. I broke into a faster pace, almost a run, trying to keep my breath steady. The road wasn't far now, but the forest seemed to close in tighter. My legs ached and my throat was dry, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the road, relief washed over me like a wave. I hurried toward the nearest farmhouse I'd seen marked on the map, hoping to find help. The house was small and old, with peeling paint and a porch swing swaying in the wind. I knocked on the door until an elderly man answered. Without saying much, I explained my situation. He listened quietly, then nodded. He called the local sheriff, who came out in a patrol car. I told them about the footsteps, the knife, and the feeling of being followed. They promised to send someone to check the area and warned me not to return alone. It turned out that the forest was a known spot for illegal hunters and sometimes people looking to hide from the law. The footsteps and the knife were I remember the summer of 2012, when I was 27 years old and feeling the itch to get away from the city for a while. I'd been working long hours at a small publishing company in Portland, Oregon, and the endless hum of traffic, screens, and people had begun to wear me down. I needed some peace and quiet, and since I had no close friends to tag along, I decided to rent a cabin on my own for a week. The idea of spending time surrounded by nature, with only the sounds of the forest, seemed like the perfect way to recharge. I found a small cabin about 45 miles east of Portland, nestled deep in the Mount Hood National Forest. The place wasn't fancy, but it was cozy. An old wooden structure, built sometime in the 70s, with a tiny porch overlooking a clearing surrounded by pine and fir trees. The rent was reasonable, and the owner assured me it was a quiet spot with little foot traffic during summer. It sounded perfect. I packed my car the night before leaving with essentials: clothes, food, a few books, a camera, and my old camping gear. I had been hiking and camping a bit as a kid, but this was going to be my first solo trip as an adult, and I wanted to make sure I was prepared. I left early in the morning to avoid the heavier weekend traffic. The drive itself was beautiful, the highway winding through the trees and along streams as I got closer to the forest. I stopped at a small market in a town called Rhododendron to grab some supplies: fresh bread, canned beans, coffee, a couple of energy bars, and a gallon of water. The clerk was friendly but seemed a little distracted, almost as if she wanted me to hurry. I didn't think much of it at the time. When I arrived at the cabin just after noon, the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. The sun was high and the forest around was alive with birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. The cabin looked even cozier up close, its weathered wood walls blending naturally into the surroundings. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was small but homey. There was a wood stove, a couple of mismatched armchairs, a small table with 2 chairs, and a tiny kitchenette with basic appliances. A narrow stairway led to a loft with a bed. The windows were thick and single-paned, offering clear views of the woods outside. There was no cell service inside, but I had brought a satellite phone just in case. I unpacked slowly, setting my things in the loft, making the bed, and preparing a simple lunch. After eating, I took a walk around the clearing, trying to get a feel for the place. The forest was dense, with tall trees that blocked much of the light as you went deeper. I marked a few trails on the map I had, thinking I might hike in the coming days. The first night was peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the crackle of the wood stove as I kept it going to stay warm. I read a bit before falling asleep, feeling calm and happy that I had made this choice. But the next day, something started to unsettle me, little by little. I woke to an eerie silence. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent. Even the wind seemed still. I shrugged it off, telling myself the forest had quiet moments. I brewed some coffee, then went out for a hike along a trail I'd planned. It was a beautiful morning, sunny but cool, the forest floor carpeted with pine needles and small ferns. As I walked deeper, I noticed something odd. The trees seemed to grow farther apart, and the undergrowth was trampled as if something heavy had moved through recently. The trail markers were missing in spots. I thought maybe a storm had knocked them down, but the weather had been clear. I pressed on for about 2 miles, then stopped at a small clearing with a stream running through it. I took pictures, drank some water, and rested for a bit. On my way back, I thought I heard a twig snap behind me. I froze, heart pounding. I waited and looked around but saw nothing. The forest was thick, and the shadows were long. I hurried back to the cabin, feeling a little jumpy. When I reached the clearing, I saw something strange by the edge of the cabin porch. An old boot, muddy and worn, just sitting there as if left by someone. I didn't recognize it, I had locked up the cabin when I left and didn't expect anyone else to be nearby. I picked it up and inspected it carefully. No one's name or initials inside. It looked like it had been here for a while. I shrugged it off again, thinking maybe a hiker had lost it weeks ago and the owner never found it. That night, I slept poorly. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in the wind made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, pacing just beyond the porch. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, but the rhythm was too steady, too heavy. I stayed still in bed, holding my breath until the sounds faded. When dawn finally came, I gathered my courage and went outside. There were footprints in the soft dirt, large and messy, circling the cabin. They weren't mine. I debated calling the cabin owner but hesitated. I had no cell signal and didn't want to cause a fuss if it was nothing. I checked the door locks and windows, made sure everything was secure. The next day, I stayed mostly inside, keeping the doors locked and the curtains drawn. I tried to focus on reading, on the sound of the forest, but my nerves were frayed. I kept hearing distant noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but never saw anyone. That afternoon, I noticed something else. The food I had carefully packed was disturbed. A few cans had been opened, some crumbs on the counter. I was certain I hadn't left the door open or forgotten anything. Fear started to creep in. Someone was here. Someone had been watching me, maybe even coming inside when I wasn't paying attention. I checked the satellite phone for signal, but still none. I felt trapped. That evening, I made sure to bolt the door and put a chair under the knob as extra protection. I kept the stove going for light and warmth, and I stayed near the window watching the clearing. Around 10 p.m., I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, pacing outside. But this time, I heard another sound, a low, guttural growl that wasn't animal. I wanted to leave to run down the mountain, but the road was dark, and I was alone. I kept the windows shut tight and waited, heart racing, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped for a long time. I thought maybe the person had left, but then I heard a soft scraping against the cabin wall, like someone fingernails or claws trying to get a grip. Panic hit me hard. I grabbed my small pocket knife, the only weapon I had, and stayed in the corner of the room. The scraping stopped, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I decided I had to get out. I packed my things quickly, grabbed my keys, and opened the door carefully. The clearing was empty except for the boot from the day before, now lying by the porch, and fresh muddy footprints leading into the woods. I didn't look back. I jumped into my car and started the engine, not caring if it was rude to leave the cabin like that. The drive down the mountain was tense. Every shadow along the road felt like eyes watching me. I kept my doors locked, the windows up. When I reached the small town, I stopped at the sheriff's office to report what happened. The deputy listened but was skeptical. "Forest gets strange sometimes," he said. "Could be anything. Hunters, hikers, or worse, people passing through." He gave me a card in case I needed help and suggested I stay somewhere safer. I didn't go back to the cabin after that. Weeks later, I looked up online for any news about the area. I found a couple of reports about missing hikers and people who had been robbed or attacked in the forest over the past few years, but nothing linked directly to the cabin. The owner of the cabin had apparently disappeared a few months before I arrived and had left the property unattended for some time. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Whoever or whatever was near the cabin was likely someone living rough in the woods, or a criminal hiding out, taking advantage of the isolation to target people like me. I never returned, and I never stayed somewhere so isolated alone again. Looking back, I'm glad I got out when I did. The fear was real, not imagined. And while I don't know exactly what was out there that week, I know the forest hides many secrets, some that can't be ignored or explained by ghost stories, just by the dangerous reality of people left to their own devices in the wild. I was 34 the first time I rented a cabin completely alone. It was late October 2022, and I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship that left me feeling completely drained. I needed to get out of the city for a while. My job in Minneapolis let me take 2 weeks off, and I didn't want to spend it around anyone I knew. I just wanted silence, space, somewhere with no phones ringing or traffic buzzing or people telling me what they thought I should be doing next. I found the cabin online. It was in northern Wisconsin, near a small lake called Dovetail Lake, surrounded by thick woods. The listing made it seem perfect: no neighbors, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. The pictures showed a small wooden structure tucked between tall pine trees, maybe 50 feet from the edge of the water. There was a dock and a small rowboat. Inside, it looked basic: just a kitchen, a wood stove, a bedroom, and a bathroom with a composting toilet. That was fine with me. I didn't want luxury. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel like I wasn't part of anything for a little while. The drive took about 5.5 hours. I left the city early, around 6 in the morning, and stopped a few times for gas and snacks. The closer I got, the more rural it became. By the time I reached the last 20 miles, I was driving on gravel roads, my tires crunching over stone and dry leaves, the trees getting thicker on both sides. The GPS cut out about 8 miles from the cabin, but I'd written the directions down beforehand. There was a narrow turnoff from the gravel road, almost hidden, marked by a rusted metal gate that was left open. A faded wooden sign next to it read Wilson Trail. That was the name of the private road the host had mentioned. It twisted through the woods for another 1.5 miles before finally opening into a small clearing with the cabin at the center. I parked right beside it. The place looked older than in the photos, with moss creeping up the base and the wood darker from years of sun and rain. But it felt right. I unlocked the door using the key from the lockbox and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood and dust, with a faint scent of smoke from the fireplace. I walked around slowly, checking everything. The electricity worked, but only for lights and the fridge. There was no TV, no microwave, no coffee machine. Just the basics. The windows were old, with latches that stuck a bit. I opened one to let in fresh air. It was completely quiet outside. Just the wind in the trees and the soft lapping of the lake. That first day, I unpacked, stacked the groceries I'd brought, made a fire in the stove, and sat on the dock for a long time with a beer in my hand. The lake was still, grayish blue under a cloudy sky, with a line of trees reflected in it like a mirror. I didn't hear a single car, plane, or voice all afternoon. Just birds and the occasional rustle of something small in the woods. The first few nights were peaceful. I read books, made simple meals, and spent most of the daylight hours outside. It got cold fast after the sun went down, so I'd keep the fire going and stay bundled up. I liked the quiet. I started sleeping better than I had in months. I could feel the tension in my shoulders and neck easing with every day that passed. But on the 5th night, something changed. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. It was pitch black in the cabin, and the fire had died down to embers. I stayed still, listening. It was that kind of silence where your ears almost buzz from the lack of sound. Then I heard it, a soft crunching noise outside. It sounded like footsteps, slow, heavy, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. Then silence again. I didn't move. My heart started beating faster. I told myself it was probably a deer. There were plenty of them in the area. But something about the rhythm of the steps, how slow and spaced out they were, made it feel different, too deliberate. I waited, holding my breath. After about 5 minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to look for tracks. The ground was soft from a light rain the night before, and I saw a few prints in the dirt by the side of the house. Not deep enough to be a bear, not sharp like deer hooves, just regular boot prints, big ones. They came from the direction of the trees, stopped near the cabin, and turned back the way they came. I stood there staring at them for a long time. There were no other cabins nearby. The host had made that clear. The nearest house was supposedly over 2 miles away, and the private road had only one entrance. I'd been keeping the gate open because I figured no one ever came out this far. But that morning I drove back down and shut it. It was old and hard to move, but I locked it with the chain provided. The rest of the day I tried to stay calm. I told myself maybe a hiker had gotten lost. Maybe a hunter, even though it wasn't the season. There wasn't any damage, and nothing had been taken. I didn't even have anything valuable out there. Still, I kept checking the windows. I brought in the axe I'd used to split firewood and kept it beside the bed that night. I didn't hear anything that night, or the next, but something in me had shifted. I wasn't as relaxed anymore. I noticed every creak in the wood, every gust of wind that rattled the roof. I still walked down to the dock in the afternoons, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, watching the tree line. I hated that I felt that way, like someone was always just out of sight, watching me. On the 8th night, I was woken again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of the back door trying to open. The handle was jiggling, slowly, softly, like someone testing it. I froze in bed. The axe was beside me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After about 10 seconds, the noise stopped. I didn't hear anything else. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling. The first light, I went outside. The back door had scratch marks around the lock. Not animal scratches. These were long, shallow marks, like from a screwdriver or knife. I walked around the cabin again. More boot prints. These were fresh. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. There was no cell service, so I couldn't call anyone from there. I decided I would drive into the nearest town, about an hour away, and use the gas station phone to call the sheriff's office, just to report it. But when I got to the gate, it was open again. The chain had been cut, not snapped, cut clean through with bolt cutters. I drove the rest of the way to the town in a kind of numb state, hands tight on the wheel, eyes on the road. When I got to the gas station, I asked the clerk if I could use the phone, and he pointed to an old rotary one in the corner. I called the sheriff's office, and after a few minutes of explaining what had happened, they said they'd send someone out to meet me at the cabin. 2 deputies arrived a few hours later. I took them around the property and showed them the prints, the scratches, the cut chain. They took notes and photos, but said there wasn't much they could do unless the person came back. I asked if it was safe for me to stay. They said it was up to me. They offered to patrol the area once a day for the next few days, but that was about all they could promise. That night, I locked every window and door, pulled the curtains, and kept the axe by my side. I didn't sleep much, just stared into the dark, listening. Nothing happened that night, or the night after. On the 3rd day, I noticed something strange while I was out near the dock. Across the lake, on the far side where the woods got thick, I saw a glint of light, just for a second, like sunlight reflecting off glass. I squinted, trying to see if there was a cabin over there, but I couldn't make anything out, just trees. Later, when I took the boat across the lake to check it out, I found a trail. Faint, barely there, but it was definitely a trail. And about 30 yards into the woods, I found an old hunting blind, one of those elevated wooden ones built between 2 trees. It was weathered and half collapsed, but inside I found some empty food wrappers, a water bottle, and a few cigarette butts, recent, and wedged under one of the boards was a crumpled piece of notebook paper. It just had numbers written on it, coordinates. I didn't understand what they meant at the time. I folded it and put it in my pocket. That night, I made a decision. I was going to leave the next morning. I didn't want to stay and wait for whoever had been creeping around at night to come back. I packed everything but kept the axe by the bed one last time. I set my alarm for 6 a.m., planning to be on the road before full daylight. But I never got to sleep. At around midnight, I heard something again. Not at the door, not on the porch, from under the cabin. The place was built on short stilts, maybe 2 feet of crawl space underneath. I heard soft scraping, like something being dragged. Then a thud, then silence. I got out of bed slowly, holding the axe. I crouched by the floor and listened. Nothing. I turned on all the lights, stepped outside, and circled the cabin. There was no one there, but I noticed that one of the wooden boards at the base had been pried loose, just enough for someone to crawl underneath. I didn't look. I didn't want to know. I got in my car, started the engine, and left. I didn't care that it was still dark. It was the spring of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend a week alone in the woods. The city was suffocating me. The noise, the crowds, the endless work at the office. I needed silence, space, and a chance to think without interruption. I found a small cabin for rent on the outskirts of a national forest in northern Michigan. It wasn't much. A simple wooden cabin, no electricity, no running water, and no phone signal. But that was exactly what I wanted. A chance to disconnect from everything. The cabin stood near the edge of a thick pine forest, with a narrow dirt road leading up to it. When I arrived in my old pickup truck, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees. The air smelled fresh and damp from a recent rain. I felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. Being alone in the woods for a week wasn't something I had done before, but I thought I could handle it. I carried my bags and supplies inside and took a slow look around. The cabin was small, about 20 by 15 feet, with a single room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom all in one. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a tiny sink connected to a rainwater barrel outside, and a fold-out cot for sleeping. The walls were rough pine logs, the floor worn but solid. A few dusty shelves held some old canned goods left by the owner. The windows were covered in thin curtains that let in faint light even after sunset. I spent that first evening lighting a fire, cooking some canned stew over the stove, and organizing my things. Outside, the forest grew darker, and the usual sounds of birds and insects began to fade as night settled in. The only noises were the crackling of the fire and the occasional snap of twigs from animals moving around. I went to bed early, tired from the trip and wanting to be ready for a full day in the woods tomorrow. The first few days passed quietly. I woke early each morning to the soft light through the curtains, brewed coffee on the stove, and explored the nearby trails. The forest was dense with pine and maple trees, the ground thick with fallen leaves and pine needles. I saw squirrels darting between branches and heard woodpeckers tapping in the distance. The air was cool and fresh. Each night, I chopped firewood for the stove and cooked simple meals. The solitude was peaceful at first. No phone calls, no emails, no distractions. I read books, wrote in a journal, and took long walks along the dirt paths. The only company was the forest and the occasional deer crossing my path. Sometimes I spotted tracks of bigger animals, maybe a bear or a wildcat, but I never saw them directly. I felt safe, careful, and respectful of the wilderness. Then, around the fourth day, something started to feel off. It began with small things. I noticed that the firewood I had carefully stacked outside was disturbed in the morning. Logs shifted or moved slightly, like something had been digging around. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind or animals brushing past, but the feeling didn't go away. One evening, as I was returning from a walk, I saw fresh footprints in the soft dirt near the cabin. Too big to be a deer, too small to be a bear. Human footprints. The prints were faint but definitely recent, and they led from the tree line toward the cabin, then disappeared near the back. I froze, staring at them. I hadn't heard any other people come near during the day. I checked all around the cabin carefully, walking in circles, but saw no signs of anyone hiding or watching. I told myself it was probably another camper or a hunter passing by, but why hadn't I seen them? And why no tracks leading back out? That night, I locked the cabin door and windows as best as I could. The lock was old and simple, but it gave me some peace. Still, I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside, a branch snapping, the wind shifting leaves, felt louder, closer. The next morning, I found the rain barrel full of water had been tipped over, spilled across the ground. That was no accident. Someone had been there again, close to the cabin. I searched for footprints around, but the rain last night had washed most of them away. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I didn't want to panic, so I spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, trying to keep my mind busy. The forest grew thicker the farther I went. The dirt paths narrowed and twisted, and the sounds of birds seemed to vanish. The sun was filtered through the thick canopy, creating strange patterns of light and shadow on the ground. I collected some dry twigs and leaves, thinking I might need extra kindling. When I returned near dusk, the cabin looked the same at first glance. but then I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. My heart pounded. I stepped closer, careful not to make noise. Inside, nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I spotted small things. My backpack was open, some items scattered on the floor, footprints in the dirt just inside the doorway. I felt a cold wave of fear. Someone had been inside. I thought about calling the owner or the local ranger station, but there was no phone signal here. I was alone. I spent the night in the cabin, holding a large kitchen knife I found in the drawer. I stayed awake most of the night, listening to every noise. Outside, I heard footsteps moving around the cabin, low rustling sounds. I didn't dare look outside. I kept the fire going, hoping the light and warmth would keep me safe. By morning, the footsteps had stopped. The forest was quiet again, almost too quiet. I knew I had to leave soon. Staying here alone was dangerous, but the dirt road was far, and I didn't have enough gas in the truck to make a quick escape. I packed my things quickly, taking only essentials and the knife. I left the cabin quietly, avoiding the areas where I had seen footprints. The forest felt different now, heavier, darker, as if the trees themselves were watching me. About halfway down the dirt road, I heard something behind me, a branch snapping, footsteps following at a distance. Quickened my pace, heart racing. I didn't dare look back. The road was narrow, lined with thick bushes and trees, and the fading light made shadows dance. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the trees ahead, blocking the road. I froze. The figure was tall, wearing dark clothes, face hidden under a hood. They didn't say anything, just stood there. I didn't know what to do. I remembered the knife in my pocket, but didn't want to use it unless absolutely necessary. The figure didn't move or speak. After a long moment, I stepped around them, keeping my eyes fixed on their feet, ready to run if needed. I ran the rest of the way to my truck, threw my bags inside, and started the engine. The figure stayed in place, watching me leave. On the drive back to the nearest town, my hands shook on the wheel. I called the local police as soon as I had signal and reported the break-in and the stranger. They said they would send officers to check the cabin and the area. The police found footprints around the cabin. Someone had been living rough nearby, watching the place. They suspected the stranger might have been a local drifter or an escaped prisoner. The forest had its dangers beyond wild animals. I never went back to that cabin. The experience stayed with me. The silence that wasn't empty, the feeling of being watched, and the stark reality that in the wilderness, people can be the scariest part. I was 34 when I rented that old cabin in northern Vermont, near the Canadian border, in the fall of 2018. I'd been living in Boston, working as a freelance photographer, but I was worn out from the noise, the traffic, and the constant flood of people. I needed a break, and I thought a week in the woods would help me clear my head. I found the place through a local ad. An older couple owned a handful of cabins near a lake called Weller Pond. It wasn't completely off the grid, but it was remote enough that I wouldn't hear a car or see a neighbor if I didn't want to. The drive up was long and winding, especially once I left the highway. I followed a dirt road for nearly 4 miles through thick forest before reaching the property. There were 3 cabins scattered around the woods, but mine was the farthest from the others, a little uphill from the pond with a small footpath that led to the water. The cabin itself was small, single-story, with dark cedar siding and a tin roof. There was a screened porch out front and a short stack of firewood beside the door. It had 1 bedroom, a small kitchen with an old gas stove, a clawfoot tub in the bathroom, and a brick fireplace in the living room. There was electricity, but no internet or TV. Cell service barely worked unless I stood out by the road. I got there just before sunset on a Wednesday. The air had that cold snap that comes right before winter, and the leaves were deep red and gold all around. The smell of pine and damp earth was strong, and the only sound I could hear was the wind moving through the trees. It was exactly what I'd been craving. I brought groceries for the week, a few books, and my camera gear. I figured I'd spend the days hiking, taking photos, maybe fishing if I had the energy. The first night was quiet. I built a fire in the hearth and sat on the old couch wrapped in a wool blanket, flipping through a dog-eared field guide someone had left on the bookshelf. Around 10, I turned off the lights and got into bed. It was so dark in the cabin once the lights were out that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. No streetlights, no headlights, just pitch black. I slept like a rock. The second day, I walked along the pond and shot a few pictures of the trees reflecting in the water. The air was completely still, and not a single ripple moved on the surface of the lake. I didn't see a single person, and by the time I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, I realized I hadn't said a word out loud all day. That night, I made pasta on the gas stove and sat outside on the porch with a mug of tea, watching the stars come out. The night was colder than the last, and I could hear the groaning of the trees as they swayed in the wind. I started noticing how different the sounds were out there, how far sound carried, how the crack of a branch somewhere in the woods could seem so much closer than it actually was. That night, I woke up around 2:30 in the morning. Something had jolted me out of a deep sleep, but I wasn't sure what. I sat up and listened. It wasn't the wind that had died down. There were no cars, no planes overhead, no insects, just silence. Then I heard it. Something light, like a shuffling sound, came from the front of the cabin, near the porch. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate. I froze, sitting up in bed, barely breathing. I didn't have a weapon, just a heavy flashlight on the nightstand. I got up as quietly as I could and moved to the front room, stepping carefully so the floorboards wouldn't creak. I looked out through the window beside the door but couldn't see anything. The porch light was off, and I hadn't left any lights on outside. After a while, I convinced myself it might have been a raccoon or maybe a branch falling. I stood there for a good 10 minutes before going back to bed. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, I went out onto the porch and looked around. The firewood stack looked untouched, nothing out of place. I checked the dirt around the cabin but didn't see any tracks. I told myself I was just on edge from being alone in the woods. Everything seems like a threat when you're out of your comfort zone. I tried to shake it off and went for a longer hike that day, up a trail that led toward a ridge above the pond. I took photos, ate a sandwich I'd packed, and stayed out until the sun started going down. When I got back, I noticed something strange. The doormat inside the front door was turned sideways. I always straighten things like that. It's a habit I've had since I was a kid. I didn't remember bumping into it. It looked like someone had opened the door and brushed it with their foot. I walked through the cabin slowly, checking each room. The place was small, so it didn't take long, but I still felt something cold crawl over me as I checked the bathroom and the tiny closet in the bedroom. Nothing seemed taken, nothing out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. That night, I pushed a chair under the doorknob and wedged a broomstick across the window latch in the kitchen. I didn't sleep much, and every creak of the old wood sounded louder than before. Around 4 a.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps moving through the leaves behind the cabin. I didn't look out the window, I just lay still, barely breathing. Eventually, the sound faded. The next day, I thought about leaving early, but I kept trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. The place was remote, sure, but I hadn't seen any real proof of anything. Still, I spent most of that day inside. I kept checking the window every few minutes, and every sound outside made me jump. Around mid-afternoon, I walked down the hill toward the pond, needing to move around. I followed the edge of the water, kicking through leaves and trying to clear my head. That's when I saw it. Across the pond, near the tree line, something was hanging from a branch. I walked around to get a closer look. It was a trail camera, the kind you strap to a tree to catch photos of wildlife. But it was pointed at the cabin. It was strapped about 10 feet off the ground, which meant whoever put it there had to use a ladder. It wasn't hidden, just slightly above eye level. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out if it had been there all along and I just missed it. I hiked back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the front room with the flashlight and a kitchen knife, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Slow, deliberate steps through dry leaves. They circled the cabin. I heard them crunching on the far side, then near the back door. I didn't dare turn on any lights. The footsteps stopped for a long time. Then I heard what sounded like something brushing against the wall. I sat in the dark, heart racing, until dawn started to break and the sounds stopped. When the sun came up, I packed my gear and tossed everything into the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I didn't look around, didn't try to find tracks. I just got in and drove. When I reached the paved road and finally got cell service again, I called the owners and told them I was leaving early. I didn't go into details. A few days later, back in Boston, I checked the photos on my camera. There were pictures I didn't remember taking. Blurry ones from inside the cabin. One looked like it had been shot from the foot of the bed, facing me while I slept. My heart dropped. I know I didn't take those. The angle, the timestamp, they didn't line up with anything I remembered doing. I brought the camera to a shop to have it checked. The guy said someone had messed with the memory card. There were fragments of deleted images, parts of the card that had been written over. I stopped using the camera after that. A couple of months later, I got an email from the couple who owned the cabins. They said they were shutting the property down indefinitely. They didn't say why. I never responded. Even now, I don't like staying anywhere remote. I haven't gone camping or rented another cabin since. I keep my doors locked at all times, and I still wonder who was out there in the woods with me, watching from the trees, moving around while I slept. I think someone had been living out there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who liked the feeling of getting close to people without being noticed. The footsteps, the camera, the pictures. I try not to think about what could have happened if I'd stayed one more night. I was 32 when I rented the cabin in the mountains of northern Vermont. It was the fall of 2021. I had just left my job at a mid-sized marketing firm in Boston. I didn't hate the job, but I hated the routine, commuting in dark mornings, eating lunch at my desk, sitting in meetings that went nowhere. I felt drained all the time, like my days were just passing without meaning. I hadn't taken a real break in years, and something in me just gave out. I gave my notice, sold most of what I didn't need, and went looking for quiet. I figured a few weeks alone in a cabin might help me think about what I really wanted. The place I found was on a rental site, listed as secluded mountain cabin perfect for long retreats. It was near a town called Barnston, which wasn't even on most maps. The cabin itself was about 7 miles outside of town, up a gravel road that snaked through the woods and climbed into the foothills. It had 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, no internet, and only spotty cell reception. That sounded perfect to me. I booked it for 6 weeks. When I got there, the owner wasn't around. He'd left the keys under a flower pot near the door. The cabin was older than the pictures made it seem. Maybe from the 60s, with dark wood panels, creaky floors, and a musty smell that stuck around for days. Still, it had charm. There was a big fireplace in the living room and a screened porch out back that looked over the slope of the hill. No neighbors, no traffic sounds, just trees and wind. The first week was calm. I slept late, made simple meals, read old paperbacks I hadn't touched in years. I hiked a few nearby trails and came back tired and dirty but satisfied. At night, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the woods. It got dark early that time of year, and the cold came down fast after sunset. The silence out there wasn't total. There were owls, the creak of branches, sometimes a fox or raccoon, but it was a kind of silence that let me think. I felt like I was finally breathing again. It was sometime during the second week that I started noticing things that felt a little off. Nothing big, just little things. I'd come in from a hike and find the woodpile moved slightly, or a kitchen cabinet open that I swore I'd closed. I chalked it up to my own habits. Maybe I just didn't remember right, but it kept happening. One morning, I found a coffee mug on the porch railing. I hadn't brought it out there. It had a small chip on the rim that I didn't recognize. I stood there a while, just staring at it. I checked all the mugs in the cabinet. None of them had chips. That one wasn't mine. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. The next morning, I found the screen door unlatched. Not open, just gently swinging. I tried not to let it get to me. I told myself animals could nudge things, or maybe the wind had caught it. But from then on, I kept hearing things at night. Rustles near the porch, soft thuds on the deck, sometimes the faint creak of the stairs outside. I started going to bed with a flashlight next to me. A few days later, I took a walk up the hill behind the cabin. I wanted to clear my head. The trees were mostly bare by then, their leaves piled in thick rust-colored drifts across the forest floor. It had rained the night before, so the ground was soft and spongy. As I moved up through the woods, I found a trail I hadn't seen before. Not marked, just a faint path that curved through the undergrowth. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curious, I followed it. It wound uphill for maybe 20 minutes, then leveled out into a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was something I wasn't expecting. A fire ring made from blackened stones. It had been used recently. There were ashes in the center and what looked like a burned beer can. Around the edges of the clearing were makeshift seats, flat rocks, logs dragged into a circle. Someone had been up there not long ago. That made the hair on my neck stand up. I hadn't seen a single person in days. There was no other cabin nearby, no signs of life except for that fire pit. I turned and walked back the way I came, faster than before, heart pounding harder with every step. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the doors and checked every window twice. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me sit up, straining to listen. Over the next few days, I kept catching signs that someone else was nearby. One morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt near the back porch, bare footprints, adult-sized. The toes were spread wide like the person had been walking slowly. The prints stopped just short of the steps, then turned and vanished into the woods. The air felt heavy after that, like something was watching. I started keeping a kitchen knife next to my bed. A few times, I thought I saw movement through the trees during the day, a shape ducking between trunks, a flicker of motion just beyond sight. But whenever I looked hard, there was nothing. It made me doubt myself. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't on anything. But the sense that I wasn't alone out there kept getting stronger. I began to feel like I was being watched all the time, even during the day. One night, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when I heard a slow, deliberate thump on the porch. Not an animal, not wind, a footstep. I turned off the light and stood completely still. Another thump, closer to the door this time. Then silence. I stood in the dark for what felt like an hour, heart hammering, listening. I never heard the door open. I never heard retreating steps. Eventually, I went to bed fully clothed, knife under the pillow. The next morning, I found scratches on the porch railing, long, thin marks, like someone had dragged a blade or nail along the wood. I checked all the doors again. No signs of forced entry. I didn't have any cameras, no way to catch who or what was doing it. I started thinking maybe I should leave early, even if I lost the deposit. But something in me didn't want to run. I felt like leaving would be giving in to fear, and I didn't want to be that kind of person. Still, I couldn't take the sense of unease anymore, so I made a plan. That night, I moved a chair into the dark corner of the living room, next to the front window. I turned off all the lights and sat quietly, waiting. I kept the flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. Around midnight, I saw it, movement at the edge of the yard. A figure, slowly approaching the cabin. Not running, just walking carefully. Stopped at the porch, then crouched. I couldn't see its face, but it stayed there for a long time, unmoving. Then it stood and walked away, back into the trees. The next morning, I hiked back up to that old trail. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Maybe a clue, maybe proof I wasn't imagining it. When I got to the clearing, I found something new. A small pile of stones stacked in a column at the edge of the fire ring. On top was a strip of cloth, red flannel, maybe from a shirt. It hadn't been there before. That broke something in me. I went back to the cabin, packed everything I could into the car, and left before sunset. I drove straight to a motel in town and didn't sleep until morning. I didn't report anything to the sheriff. What would I say? There's someone in the woods who likes creeping around cabins at night? I didn't go back to the cabin to finish the stay. The owner never contacted me, and I never contacted him. I left a review that just said, "Secluded, peaceful. Be prepared for wildlife." Months later, I looked up the area again, just out of curiosity. I found an old news article from 2003, barely a few paragraphs. A man had gone missing hiking in the hills near Barnston. His body was never found. They closed the case after a few months. No leads, just gone. The article included a photo. The man was wearing a red flannel shirt. I haven't gone camping since. I live in a small apartment now, on the 5th floor of a busy building in Providence. I hear my neighbors through the walls. I hear sirens outside every night. I keep a baseball bat under the bed, but I've never had to use it. Sometimes I think back to that cabin and wonder who was out there. Someone living off the grid? Someone who didn't want to be found? Or maybe someone who liked being seen, just not too clearly. I don't know, but I know I wasn't imagining it. I saw the footprints. I heard the steps. I saw the figure crouch on my porch. And that's enough for me. That trip taught me something. Some places aren't empty. Some silences are full. And when you go looking for peace and quiet, you should be sure you're not walking into someone else's territory. I haven't been back to Vermont. I don't think I ever will. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a break from everything. I just turned 34, and after going through a stressful year at my job in Birmingham, I needed a reset. I wanted to get away from noise, from people, from technology. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to answer emails, didn't even want to hear a car pass by. A friend of mine had mentioned an old hunting cabin he used to visit in the early 2000s, deep in the hills of West Virginia, not too far from a town called Hartsville. He hadn't been there in years, but he said the place was still standing, off-grid, with no power or running water, just a wood stove and some old furniture. That sounded perfect to me. I got the directions from him, scribbled notes on a torn sheet of notebook paper, with references to things like a broken fence post, a hollow tree with an old horseshoe nailed to it, and a stone well with no bucket. It took me almost 8 hours to drive there from where I lived in Kentucky, and the last 30 miles were nothing but winding dirt roads and steep, washed-out paths that looked like they hadn't been driven on since the 90s. I had to park my car near a dried creek bed and hike the last mile and a half with my pack on my back. The cabin was smaller than I expected. One room with a sagging roof, a narrow porch, and a few rotting steps leading up to the door. The windows had thick layers of grime on them, and the wood siding was gray and dry and cracked from years of weather. But it was standing. I opened the door and the smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. There were mouse droppings on the floor and cobwebs in every corner. But the stove was intact, the roof didn't leak, and the place felt solid. I spent the first few hours cleaning, sweeping out the dead leaves, wiping down surfaces with water I boiled from a nearby stream, and laying out my sleeping bag on the old cot against the wall. The first night was quiet, uncomfortably quiet. I'm used to hearing the hum of a fridge, the distant sound of cars, maybe the low buzz of a street lamp. But here there was nothing, just the occasional creak of the trees outside or the scurry of some small animal under the floorboards. I didn't sleep well, but I wasn't scared. Not yet. I told myself it would take a few days to adjust. During the day, I kept busy. I brought enough food for a week, mostly canned stuff and vacuum-sealed meals, and I spent time collecting firewood, boiling water, and writing in a journal I'd brought with me. I didn't have a cell signal, which I knew ahead of time, and that was fine. I told my sister where I was going and when I'd be back. The plan was to stay 6 days and hike out on the 7th morning. On the second day, I found an old trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. It was barely visible, just a faint path through the undergrowth, but it looked like it had been used long ago. Out of curiosity, I followed it for about a mile until it dead-ended at a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing, there was a rusted-out truck, half buried in vines and weeds, with a tree growing through the engine block. The truck's doors were missing, and the inside was full of leaves and debris, but the metal frame was still solid. It looked like it had been there for decades. I took a few pictures on my camera and turned back. That was the first time I felt something odd, not fear exactly, but a sense that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder on the way back, but there was nothing there. That night, I heard something outside. It was well past midnight. I'd been lying awake for hours, eyes open in the dark, staring at the shadowed outline of the ceiling. Then I heard crunching, slow, deliberate steps on the gravel path just outside the porch. Not an animal. It was too heavy, too careful. My heart started pounding. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps stopped right outside the door. Then silence. I stared at the door for what felt like an hour, my ears straining for any sound. But nothing else happened. I eventually fell asleep, but only for a couple hours. In the morning, I checked the area outside. There were no obvious footprints, just a few patches of disturbed gravel. Could have been anything, I told myself. A raccoon, a deer, but I knew the difference. I've lived in the countryside before. I know what animals sound like when they walk. This was something else, something on two legs. I considered hiking out early, but I told myself I was being paranoid. That's what isolation does. It messes with your senses. I tried to shake it off and kept busy that day. I walked back to the clearing, partly to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. I poked around the truck again, looking for any sign that someone else had been there. Nothing. I stayed longer than I should have. By the time I started heading back, the sun was already dipping low, and the forest started to look different, darker, heavier. I moved faster on the return, and somewhere along the way, I lost the trail. Just for a few minutes. I knew the general direction back to the cabin, but I couldn't find the exact path. I walked in circles, trying to retrace my steps. The undergrowth was thicker than I remembered. Everything looked the same. It was getting harder to see. Eventually, I found the broken stump I recognized from earlier and made it back. But that short detour shook me. I didn't like the feeling of being lost, even if just briefly. That night, the sound came back, the same slow crunching outside. But this time, it didn't stop at the porch. I heard it walk around the side of the cabin, then the back, then nothing. I sat up in bed, gripping my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. I just sat there in the dark, heart hammering, listening. I didn't sleep at all that night. On the fourth day, I found something strange. I was gathering firewood about 50 yards from the cabin when I spotted something hanging from a low tree branch. It was a piece of cloth, faded and torn, tied into a knot. It looked like a piece of shirt or pants, maybe denim. I didn't remember seeing it before. I looked around the area more carefully and found another piece, further down. Then a small pile of bones, probably animal bones, arranged in a circle. It looked deliberate, not something a coyote or a raccoon would do. I didn't touch any of it. I just stood there for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I turned and walked back, trying not to run. That evening, I didn't eat. Couldn't. I kept thinking about the cloth, the bones, the footsteps at night. I started packing some of my things. My plan was to leave at first light. I didn't want to spend another night there, but hiking out in the dark was worse. I set my alarm for 5 a.m., packed what I could into my bag, and rolled out my sleeping bag again. I left my boots by the door and kept my flashlight and knife within arm's reach. At around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of the front door handle moving. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A slow turn, then a slight rattle. My blood froze. I didn't move. I just stared at the door. The handle moved again, just slightly. Then silence. Then a few minutes later, I heard footsteps again. This time, they didn't walk away. They stopped directly outside the wall near where I was lying. I could hear the faint crunch of the dirt as weight shifted from one foot to another. Then, nothing. I didn't sleep again. I waited until dawn. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I got up, pulled on my boots, and slung my pack over my shoulders. I didn't bother eating. I didn't clean up. I just left. The walk back was long and miserable. Every noise in the forest made me jump. I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me, but I didn't see anyone. I finally reached my car, threw my pack into the back seat, and got the hell out of there. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I told my sister I cut the trip short because I felt sick. I didn't want to sound crazy, but But a few weeks later, I did some digging. I looked up old reports about that area, Hartsville, the surrounding woods, any news stories from the past few decades. I found a few articles about missing hikers, a couple of unsolved disappearances, mostly from the 80s and 90s. Nothing definitive, but enough to confirm that others had gone missing in those woods. No evidence, no suspects, just gone. I never went back. I still think about it sometimes, especially at night. The sound of footsteps, the door handle moving, the pieces of cloth tied to trees. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to. But I know one thing. Someone was watching me. Someone who didn't want me there. And I'm just glad I got out before they decided to do more than watch. That trip changed how I see places like that. The kind of places people forget. Deep in the woods where cell service disappears and help is miles away. The kind of places where things can happen and no one ever finds out. I still like the outdoors, but I stick to marked trails now. I don't go off-grid, and I don't stay in cabins that aren't on a map. Some peace and quiet just isn't worth it. It was the spring of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city life that had been weighing me down for years. I was 29 then, tired of the endless noise, the crowded streets, and the constant pressure at my office job in Minneapolis. I wanted something different, something quiet, simple, and far away from people. That's why I chose a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, about 50 miles from the nearest town, tucked between tall pines and rough, rocky hills. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1940s, made of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney on one side and a small porch out front. It wasn't fancy. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove for heat and a well nearby for water. I rented it for 2 weeks, telling myself it would be a good time to clear my head, read some books, maybe do a bit of fishing in the lake a mile down the dirt road. The idea of being completely alone, with no phone signal and no internet, scared me a little but also excited me. I packed my gear carefully, took my old pickup, and drove out there. The last 10 miles were on a gravel road, bumpy and winding. When I finally pulled up, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the forest. The smell of pine and damp earth hit me immediately. The cabin looked even smaller than I imagined, surrounded by towering trees that swayed gently in the breeze. I unloaded my bags, mostly food, a few clothes, my fishing rod, and some firewood I brought just in case. I noticed the place was quiet in a way that felt strange, almost too quiet. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just the soft rustle of leaves. Inside, the cabin was dim but cozy. The floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the last rays of light through the window. The furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a shelf with some old books and canned food left behind by previous renters. I stacked some firewood by the stove and started a small fire. The warmth felt good against the cool air creeping in through the cracks in the walls. That first night, I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the sounds outside. The wind picking up, the trees rubbing against each other, maybe some animal moving quietly in the brush. I felt uneasy but told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Still, I double-checked the locks on the door before finally drifting off to sleep. The next few days passed slowly but uneventfully. I spent mornings fishing by the lake, afternoons chopping wood and reading, and evenings cooking simple meals over the stove. The isolation was peaceful, but as time went on, I noticed small things that unsettled me. My boots would be out of place after I left them by the door, or the firewood I carefully stacked would be scattered on the floor. Once, I thought I heard footsteps outside, crunching over dry leaves, but when I looked out, there was no one there. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel watched. On the 4th day, as the sun was low in the sky, I went for a walk along a narrow trail behind the cabin. The trees were dense there, making it hard to see far. Suddenly, I noticed strange marks carved into the bark of several trees. Deep scratches, almost like someone had been sharpening a knife. The pattern didn't look natural. It made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. Maybe some hunters or campers had passed by before me. That night, I lay awake again, this time hearing something more distinct, a low, slow knocking on the cabin door. I sat up fast, heart pounding, but when I looked, no one was there. I waited for a long time, expecting the knocking to come back, but it didn't. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found a small pile of rocks neatly stacked by the porch steps. I hadn't put them there. Whoever was out there was playing with me, trying to unsettle me. I wanted to leave immediately, but remembered I had no cell signal, and the nearest road was miles away. I was stuck. That day, I kept the windows and door locked, only going outside to get water from the well. I tried to keep busy, chopping more wood and cleaning the cabin, but my nerves were fraying. The silence outside felt heavier, like something was lurking just beyond the trees. By the 6th day, I was sure someone was watching me. I found footprints in the mud near the back of the cabin, too big to be any animal. I followed them carefully, but they disappeared abruptly in the thick undergrowth. Whoever had been there had been cautious. I thought about making noise to scare them off. I hammered nails into the wooden walls, banged pots and pans. Nothing. The next morning, the cabin looked the same except for a new message scratched into the doorframe. Just a single word, "Go." My blood ran cold. I had never felt this scared before. I thought about calling the police, but I still had no signal, and the nearest town was too far to walk. I packed my bags hurriedly, deciding to leave at first light. That night was the worst. The knocking returned, this time louder and more frantic. It went on for hours. I stayed awake, clutching an old hunting knife I found under the floorboards, ready for anything. When the knocking finally stopped, I heard whispers outside, low and quick, just beyond the cabin walls. I stayed frozen, heart racing, until dawn broke. At first light, I grabbed my bags and ran to my truck. As I drove away down the gravel road, I looked back once. In the window of the cabin, I thought I saw a figure standing, watching me leave, but when I blinked, it was gone. Back in town, I called the sheriff and told him everything. They searched the area but found no sign of anyone. The marks on the trees, the footprints, the messages, they found nothing. They said it was probably some prank by local kids. But I knew better. I never went back to that cabin. The whole experience stayed with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the very real presence of another person watching, waiting, and wanting you gone. I still think about those nights, the silence that wasn't silence, and the feeling of being utterly alone but not alone at all. The cabin, the woods, and that endless quiet, they changed me forever. It was the spring of 2017 when I decided to take a short break from everything and spend a few days in a remote cabin deep in the Black Hills of South Dakota. I had found the place through a small listing on a local site that specialized in private rentals. Nothing too fancy. Just a one-room wooden cabin with a wood stove, a cot, a small kitchen space, and an outhouse a few yards behind it. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no neighbors for miles. I was 32 at the time, working in architectural drafting, and after months of long hours and deadlines, I felt burned out in a way that coffee and weekends couldn't fix. I didn't want distractions. I wanted quiet. The drive out there took about 5 hours from Rapid City. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, it was nearly dusk. The rental instructions included a crude hand-drawn map since GPS didn't work once you got a few miles into the woods. That road was rough. Just 2 tire tracks worn into the earth, with grass growing tall between them. I had rented a beat-up Subaru for the trip, and even with its all-wheel drive, the car bounced and rattled as I eased over potholes and branches. The cabin was more isolated than I'd imagined. It sat in a narrow clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, their tops swaying in the wind, casting long shadows across the front porch. The place was smaller than it looked in the photos, maybe 20 feet by 15, but sturdy. The exterior logs were weathered, and the metal roof was spotted with rust. A stone chimney jutted out the side, and there was a hand pump for water just off the porch. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and old ash. The furniture was minimal. A single cot pushed up against the back wall, a small wooden table with two mismatched chairs, and a couple of shelves stocked with cans of beans, soup, and a few cooking utensils. The windows were small and placed high on the walls, which made the inside dim even with the sun still up. The only real source of light was a kerosene lantern hanging from a hook in the center of the ceiling. The first night was uneventful. I lit the stove with some difficulty, boiled a can of chili, and ate it while listening to the quiet outside. The silence was thick out there. Not the kind you get in the city or even the suburbs, where there's always some kind of hum or distant noise. This was complete silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling or the wind brushing against the walls. I didn't sleep well that first night. The cot was lumpy and short, and I kept waking up to the sounds of branches tapping the windows or thuds I couldn't place. At some point, I convinced myself it was just squirrels or maybe a raccoon messing around outside. I kept my flashlight close, but I never actually got up to check. By morning, the woods looked different, brighter, warmer. I cooked eggs and toast over the little propane burner I'd brought and ate on the front step, watching the light crawl over the trees. There wasn't a trail around, so I wandered a bit in the woods, just taking everything in. No phone, no emails, no other people. I felt calm for the first time in a while. That day passed slow and peaceful. I made a fire in the pit outside, chopped a little wood that the owners had left stacked behind the cabin, and spent the evening drawing in a sketchbook I hadn't touched in months. The quiet was starting to feel good. That changed on the third night. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something heavy landing on the porch. It wasn't loud, but it was definite, like someone had dropped a duffel bag or stepped down from a truck bed. I froze in my cot, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. The fire in the stove had gone out, and the cabin had turned cold. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me and listened. I told myself it could have been an animal, a deer, maybe a bear, but there was no snorting, no scuffling, no clawing, just that one sound and then silence. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to sit up and grab the flashlight. I didn't want to open the door. The idea of shining the beam into the woods and seeing something I didn't understand rooted me in place. But after a while, the tension faded, and I slipped back under the bag and drifted off. In the morning, I checked the porch. There were no tracks, no fur, no signs of anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. I went through the routine again, breakfast, sketching, walking the woods, but something about the mood had shifted. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt like they were watching. I noticed a few things that day that didn't sit right. A tree about 20 feet from the cabin had long, thin scratches in the bark. Not deep, but deliberate, parallel. Not the kind of marks deer or elk make. They looked more like someone had dragged a blade lightly down the surface. Later, when I went out to the outhouse, I noticed the door didn't latch the same way it had before. It hung a little loose on its hinges, like it had been opened and shut without care. I hadn't used it since the day before, and I was sure I had latched it properly. Still, I fixed it and tried to brush it off. That night, I decided to stay up. I left the kerosene lantern burning low and sat at the little table with a thermos of coffee, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, something moving outside, but not close, just on the edge of the woods. I turned the lantern down and held my breath. Whatever it was moved slowly, with a rhythm that didn't sound like an animal. Stopped for a long while, then started again, closer this time. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun came up, I was outside immediately, circling the cabin. Again, nothing. No prints, no marks. But this time, something had changed. The axe I'd left buried in the chopping block was gone. The block was still there. The split wood was still stacked neatly, but the axe was missing. That was the moment things started to feel real. Not imagined, not paranoia. Something or someone was out there. I searched around the area and found nothing. No broken branches, no dropped items. The woods were still. I considered packing up and leaving, but I hadn't seen anyone, and there was always the chance that I'd left the axe somewhere else, even if I was sure I hadn't. I told myself I'd go one more night and head out first thing the next morning. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking over my shoulder and keeping the cabin door shut tight. I didn't go into the woods. I didn't sketch. I just waited. That night was cold and tense. I didn't turn off the lantern. I sat by the stove, listening to the wind rattle the tin roof and waiting for the inevitable. Around 3, I heard movement again, closer this time. Steady, careful steps across the porch. Then a low creak of the floorboards. The doorknob turned. I stood frozen, watching it rotate just a little, not enough to open, then stop. Whoever was out there didn't knock, didn't speak, didn't try to force the door. They just tried the handle, then waited. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The handle stayed still for what felt like an hour. Then footsteps retreated slowly down the steps. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink. By the time morning came, I was packed and gone within 10 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't look back. I drove that Subaru like it was on fire, jostling hard over the dirt road until I hit pavement and cell signal. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of Rapid City, pulled into a gas station, and sat there for half an hour before I could get myself to speak to anyone. I called the owner of the cabin that afternoon and told him what happened. He didn't sound surprised, just quiet. He said the cabin had been broken into once before, tools stolen, nothing else. No signs of forced entry. They'd blamed hunters, but after I told him about the axe, the noises, the doorknob, he didn't argue. Just said he'd check it out and thanked me for letting him know. I never heard from him again. I never went back. Weeks later, I read an article in a local paper about a missing hiker not far from that area. Disappeared while camping solo. No signs of foul play. Tent still standing. Food untouched. Just gone. I tried not to make connections, but the timeline made sense. The location wasn't far. I don't know if it was the same person who came to my cabin, but I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door that night, or if I had fallen asleep. I kept the sketchbook from that trip. The drawings aren't anything special, just trees, shadows, bits of the cabin. But in a few of them, toward the end, I started drawing a figure I don't remember seeing. Just a shape between the trees, always in the same spot, always watching. I didn't mean to draw it. I think some part of me knew something was out there before I did. Something quiet, patient, not a ghost or monster, just a man. And that's what stays with me. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't fantasy. It was real. It was human. And that makes it worse. I moved later that year, changed jobs, switched cities. I still go camping, but never alone, and never that deep. Some places aren't meant for people to stay in too long, not because of what's in the woods, but because of who. I was 34 when I rented the cabin in early October of 2018. I remember the year clearly because it was right after a stretch of rough months. My job as a freelance contractor had dried up a bit, and I was tired of the city, the noise, and the pressure. My girlfriend had just moved out a couple of weeks earlier, and the apartment felt smaller and heavier than ever. I wanted silence, not just peace and quiet, but a kind of deep silence that you can only find far from people, where your own breath and footsteps are the only things you hear. So I started looking online for remote places to stay for a while. Not a hotel, not a resort, just some isolated cabin in the woods where I could think and maybe get back to writing. I found one on a website that listed privately owned properties. It was a little A-frame cabin outside a town called Berner, up in northern Minnesota. Population maybe 400. The owner was some older guy named Carl who lived in Arizona and only used the place in summer. He had a bunch of pictures on the listing: old wooden floors, a basic kitchen, a fireplace, a loft with a small bed, and big windows looking out at miles of pine and birch trees. There was no cell service and no internet, which was exactly what I wanted. Just trees and wind and time to myself. He charged $250 a week, which felt like a steal. I booked it for 2 weeks and drove up alone. I remember the drive taking longer than it should have. The roads kept getting narrower, and once I passed the last gas station, it was another 40 miles of empty roads winding through thick forest. I didn't pass another car for nearly an hour. When I finally got to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Weathered wood, a slightly sagging porch, some leftover firewood stacked against the side. There was a hand-painted sign nailed to a post. Nelson's. That was the guy's last name, I assumed. I parked beside the cabin and took my bags inside. Everything creaked, floorboards, doors, even the stairs going up to the loft. The air smelled like old wood and dust. I didn't mind. The place had character. The main floor had a small sitting area, a wood-burning fireplace with a blackened iron grate, and a narrow kitchen with a gas stove and a tiny fridge. The bathroom was in the back and had a small shower stall with yellowed tile. The loft upstairs was just big enough for the bed and a small dresser. Everything was simple and quiet. Perfect. I spent the first day unpacking and settling in. I brought enough food to last the whole stay: canned goods, dry stuff, a small cooler of perishables. I didn't want to have to drive back out. That evening, I sat on the porch with a beer and watched the light fade through the trees. It was colder than I expected, especially after dark. The wind moved through the trees in waves, and the only other sound was the occasional rustle of something small moving in the underbrush. The first few days were good. I went for walks along the overgrown trails behind the cabin. I cooked simple meals, wrote a little in a notebook I brought, and read from a stack of paperbacks I'd been meaning to finish. The stillness of the place worked its way into me. I'd sleep long and deep and wake up feeling like I'd barely moved all night. I didn't feel lonely or scared. If anything, I felt better than I had in months. But around the fourth or fifth day, I started to notice little things. It started with small, almost stupid stuff. I'd come down in the morning and notice a kitchen drawer was open, even though I clearly remembered shutting it the night before, or a chair would be slightly out of place. I told myself it was just me being distracted, or maybe I bumped something without noticing. But it kept happening. I left a can opener on the counter, came back after a walk, and it was in the drawer. One morning, the front door was unlocked, even though I always double-checked it before bed. I started to get uneasy, not scared exactly, just off. It was like the cabin didn't hold still. Every time I turned around, something felt slightly rearranged. I wasn't sure what to do about it. There was no one around for miles. The road leading to the cabin was barely more than a gravel path, and I hadn't seen another human being since I got there. I started locking the door every time I went out, even if it was just to chop firewood or pee in the trees. I checked the windows each night, made sure they were latched. Still, that feeling crept in, that maybe someone had been there while I was gone, that maybe someone was still there watching from the woods. One night I couldn't sleep. The wind was stronger than usual and kept making the trees creak and groan. I lay in bed upstairs, staring at the ceiling, and I heard something soft, like footsteps, across the floor downstairs. It wasn't loud, more like shifting weight. I sat up and waited. Nothing. I thought maybe it was an animal outside, maybe a raccoon trying to get into the trash. I went down with the flashlight and looked around. Everything was still. The door was locked. I turned on a light and checked the kitchen, the bathroom, even opened the front door and looked outside. I didn't see anything, but I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, I found the back door, usually bolted shut, slightly ajar, just cracked. I never used that door. The bolt was unlocked. Even though I remembered sliding it into place days ago, I started checking every inch of the place. I looked behind the furniture, under the bed, inside the kitchen cabinets. I didn't find anything, but I started to feel like I was being watched. When I stepped outside, I kept turning around quickly, expecting to see someone duck behind a tree. I couldn't shake the thought that someone was living nearby, or worse, had gotten inside. That afternoon, I went around the cabin and looked for signs. Footprints, broken branches, anything. I found what looked like a small piece of fabric snagged on a bush behind the outhouse. It was gray and thin, maybe part of a shirt. Could have been there for years, but it looked fresh. I picked it up, then dropped it. It didn't feel right. That evening, I built a fire inside and stayed close to it. I left the lights on even after I went upstairs. Every creak made my muscles tense. At some point, I drifted off, still dressed, a flashlight in my hand. Around 2 a.m., I woke up and listened. Nothing. Then I heard it, faint but clear footsteps outside on the gravel path. Slow, deliberate, then silence. I held my breath and waited. No knock, no sound at the door. I didn't go down. I just sat there for hours, heart pounding, watching the stairs. Eventually, light started to creep in through the windows. When the sun came up, I went outside with the hatchet I kept near the firewood pile. I checked around the cabin. I found the prints' boot treads clearly fresh. They came from the trees, walked around the cabin once, then disappeared back into the woods. I couldn't tell where they went, but I knew then someone was out there. I decided I was done. I packed my stuff that morning and loaded the car, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to turn over, just silence. I tried again and nothing. I popped the hood and looked inside, though I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't see anything obviously wrong, but one of the battery cables looked loose, like it had been pulled halfway off. I don't know if that could have happened on its own, but it didn't look right. I tightened it and tried again. Still nothing. I sat there for a while thinking. My phone was useless out there. No signal. I hadn't seen another person in nearly a week. The nearest house was probably 20 miles away, maybe more. I considered walking, but I didn't want to leave my stuff behind, and I wasn't even sure which way to go without driving back the way I came. So I stayed another night even though I didn't want to. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair near the fireplace with the flashlight and hatchet in my lap. I kept the fire going and every so often walked around inside, checking the windows. Around midnight I heard something again. A soft noise like fabric brushing wood. Then I saw movement outside, just a flash, something low and fast near the side of the house. I ran to the window but didn't see anything. Then I heard it again, a faint scrape at the back door. Not knocking, just dragging. I stayed up all night. Nothing else happened, but I didn't relax. I didn't even blink too long. When the sun rose, I tried the car again. Same result. I had enough. I took my pack, put a few essentials inside: food, flashlight, knife, and left. I locked the door behind me, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. I followed the gravel road as best I could, hoping it would eventually bring me to a gas station or a main road. I walked for hours. I didn't see anyone, but I kept hearing things behind me. Twigs snapping, quick footsteps, but when I turned around, there was nothing. After about 5 hours of walking, I saw a sign. It was old and rusty, but it pointed toward Burner, 6 miles. I kept going and eventually reached the edge of the town, where a guy in a pickup stopped and gave me a lift the rest of the way. I didn't tell him everything, just said my car broke down at the cabin and I needed help. He nodded like it wasn't the first time he'd heard something like that. Back in town, I used a payphone to call a tow truck. I rode with them out to the cabin.